Are there any photographs of Regina and what it looked like in 1867? Asked Teresa, an international student taking an urban planning class. 1867 was the year that Canada was founded, and at that time, the area around Regina was nothing more than wilderness, bald prairie. But Teresa, who was from the north of Italy, didn't know that. Several of the local students laughed, and Jordan said, "Teresa, would you really like to see what Regina looked like in 1867? "Yes, that's why I asked," she said with some asperity. Jordan said with a laugh, "Then just drive 10 minutes out of the city and stop by the side of the road. Then you'll see what Regina was like in 1867. Bald prairie." Teresa pouted. She didn't like being made fun of. But after class, Jordan, who thought she was pretty hot, came up to her and said, "If you want, Teresa, I can take you for a drive out of town and show you how the landscape would have looked back then." Teresa was intrigued. Besides, she liked Jordan too. So the next Saturday, they headed out on a short road trip to a small francophone town known, interestingly enough, for the production of quality mustard. The town also boasted a huge Catholic church, although nothing on the scale of the ancient churches in Italy, as well as an excellent little restaurant. They were proceeding along the highway south of Moose Jaw when Teresa first began to feel uneasy. Jordan had pulled off the highway onto a small overlook at the base of a rusty water tower, a lookout which provided a panoramic view of the countryside to the southwest, a vista of rolling green hills fading towards the far horizon, fading towards infinity. Standing next to Teresa, standing quite close, Jordan pointed towards a silvery line off in the distance. "See that line there?" he said. "That's Old Wives Lake, the lake that disappeared." "Disappeared?" Teresa was astonished, but she also half suspected that Jordan was making fun of her again. "Yeah, in 1988, during a terrible drought out here," Jordan continued. "Back before the Europeans came, the Blackfoot and the Cree, those are two First Nations tribes, were at war. At one point, some Cree wandered into Blackfoot territory, where the lake is, after game, only to be attacked. The Cree knew the Blackfoot would renew their attack if they thought their enemy was trying to escape, so they had 3 old women, old wives, stay in camp tending the fires all night to create the impression the Cree were remaining encamped while the rest of the band fled into the darkness. In the morning, when the Blackfoot did attack and found only the old wives, they were so incensed they drowned the old women in the lake." "Oh, how horrible," Teresa said with a shudder. "They say that on certain nights, like when there's a full moon, you can hear the old women calling from an island out in the center of the lake," Jordan concluded. "It sounds almost medieval," Teresa said, still shuddering. Jordan just laughed. "Oh, that's only a story. Besides, I don't see how you could drown in that lake. It was only about 5 feet deep before it dried up. But let's hit the road, shall we?" And so they did. But the mood had subtly and fundamentally shifted, and Teresa found herself becoming increasingly more and more nervous. increasingly frightened. Teresa felt there was something totally alien about this vast, barren prairie landscape. It was too big, on a scale unimaginable to a European. Even the sky was too big, a blue, merciless heaven that overhung and overawed them. A great empty space. For where were all the people? They hadn't seen a solitary person since leaving Moose Jaw. In fact, there was very little traffic. Very little. They had just turned onto a road heading west when something white and low to the ground darted across the road. Teresa screamed and Jordan hit the brakes so hard his old Ford Ranger began to fishtail and almost ended up in the ditch. What's wrong?" Jordan blurted. What is that thing?" Teresa cried, pointing at a gnarly brownish-white object which squatted on the shoulder of the road. Once again Jordan laughed. "Oh, that's a tumbleweed." And when it became obvious that Teresa didn't know what he was talking about, he explained. "A tumbleweed is a plant that spreads its seeds by rolling across the countryside, pushed by the force of the wind. The wind breaks them off and they just roll. And the wind does seem to be picking up," he concluded. "It's just a plant, not an animal," she said, with a tremor in her voice. "Yep, basically a dead thing, driven by the wind," Jordan said before adding. "And yeah, the wind is picking up." Indeed it was. The sky, which had been vividly blue only minutes before, had now turned an ominous yellow-gray. It was darker, and Teresa could now feel the wind buffeting the small truck. "Maybe we should turn around," Teresa squeaked. "Really?" Jordan was dumbfounded. "We're almost there. Another 20 minutes, maybe." "But it looks like it's going to storm." Teresa was adamant, and indeed, mist had gathered on the horizon, an incoming wall of rain. Teresa sat bolt upright in the passenger seat, staring tensely ahead, and Jordan attempted to lighten the mood by pointing out that even if they turned around, they wouldn't have been able to outrun the storm. But Teresa was no longer looking at the wispy trails of approaching rain, but at movement along the horizon. A lot of movement. It was as if the prairie was alive, a churning mass of silver, white, and brown. A tumbleweed broke across the highway, and Jordan shouted, It's tumbleweeds! Hundreds of them, rolling across the prairie! The wind must be terrific! Hold on!" The horizon directly before them was a sea of tumbling, rolling, bouncing, rocketing tumbleweeds of all sizes, most the size of footballs or basketballs, but some as big as shrubs or large bushes. The wind struck the truck, shaking it with an invisible hand, while the tumbleweeds got underneath the tires, underneath the vehicle, and completely engulfed Jordan's field of vision. Blinded, he braked, only to fishtail and lose control as the truck hit the ditch and overturned. Teresa found herself hanging upside down in gathering darkness. She yelled for Jordan over and over, but he didn't answer. Still, she could hear other voices, loud voices, some speaking English, some in languages she didn't recognize. Was someone coming to help them? And then, with a shock and a sinking feeling, she realized the voices came from the tumbleweeds, and that the English voices were chanting, "Death! Death! Death!" And then it all went black. In the end, they found Jordan's pickup truck in the ditch, battered and empty. Teresa and Jordan were gone. They have never been found. But according to the weather office, that day had been a lovely fall day with no precipitation and no strong winds. And there the mystery stayed, but for an odd sequel. A friend of mine was driving the same stretch of highway where Teresa and Jordan had met their end, when his vehicle was also assailed by high winds and by tumbleweeds. He crashed but managed to crawl away, although he was almost suffocated by the tumbling weeds. You know the weirdest thing of all, Warren? I hallucinated that the tumbleweeds were talking to me. I even heard some woman speaking Italian. My buddy is Italian. He says the female voice was screeching, "Morte, morte, morte, morte," which means death. The moral of the story: a romantic day trip can be fun, but remember, death never takes a holiday. If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the night floaters, werewolves, and the black-eyed children. So again, please consider subscribing. Please help me to reach my goal of 2,500 subs in 2022. Till midnight. Cheers. Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pix Here, that's PX Here, while the music was the ominous Aftermath by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod.